garden project that I started in 1994. Just to begin with, I'll define what I mean by forest garden, because I expect most of you have a pretty good idea anyway. But what I mean by a forest garden is, it's a three-dimensional garden using trees of different sizes, certainly in a garden this scale, tall trees, smaller trees, shrubs, stuff going on the perennial layer as well, all designed to work together as much as possible, minimise competition, designed to be very low input system, the input's energy, my energy mostly, and be fairly productive. Now in our climate, a forest garden has to have a fairly open structure, so it is not like a forest. Let's make that clear to begin with, which is a slight problem with the name, but I didn't coin the name, because when you say forest in our culture, people tend to think, where you can see the conifers over there, that kind of forest, high forest, canopies touching of trees, and in that situation there's deep shade underneath, and you can actually do very little productively, in that kind of shade in our climate. There's not enough sun energy gets down to grow very much at all. So in our climate, a forest garden has to have a much more open structure. It's more like that of a young woodland, young establishing woodland, and it's maintained, at that kind of level. Forest gardens, everybody's forest garden is different. There are hundreds in this country now, because they're always designed around the needs of whoever's garden it is. But usually they have mostly edible plants in, but they may have other things too, and certainly this forest garden is partly demonstration and partly research. And so I have a lot of different plants in. I have medicinal plants and plants for fibre use and plants for dyeing, and all sorts of stuff as well. So, when I say it's a garden of useful plants, of course, useful can mean different things to different people. And useful doesn't necessarily mean directly useful to humans. It's actually something you pick, because there are plants in here and in most forest gardens that have a function to aid the whole system, and not to be directly used by me. So comfrey is a good example. This is the true medicinal comfrey, Symphytum officinale, beneath this apricot tree. And although it is a medicinal plant, really it's here for two reasons, two main functions. One is to help feed the fruit tree, and the other is as a fantastic bee plant as well. So none of those, are a direct harvest to me, but they're very important functions to keep everything sustained, and sustainable. Because whatever system you have of growing plants, if it's mainly for food or whatever, if you want your system to be sustainable, you have to devote some of the resources in that system to, sustaining the system itself. So a bit like, in a rotation, having a green manure year, in amongst other plants, you have to devote some of the area, some of the time, to plants with a system function, because that's the only way you can get sustainability. Okay. Do stop me and fire off questions, okay, as we go.
Can I just ask you,
yes.
How is that comfrey useful to that apricot tree?
Yeah, comfrey works because it's a very deep-rooted mineral accumulator, and the root structure of comfrey is very different from that of the fruit tree. Most of the roots on this apricot tree will be about this deep, 30-40 centimetres deep. They'll go outwards. They'll have very few deep tap roots, whereas comfrey has a lot of deep tap roots, and they'll go, so rooting wise they don't use the same soil areas very much, and so comfrey roots might well go down 3 or 4 metres, 5 metres maybe. It's hard to know exactly, but some around that. And comfrey is particularly good at getting potassium out of the soil. So all parts of comfrey are very rich in potassium, the top, and of course all the roots as well. And how that becomes available to other plants like this tree is some becomes available anyway, just through the normal growing process and the comfrey dying down in autumn, because when it dies down, of course, some nutrients are taken back into the roots by the comfrey itself, but others just rot down, in the dead stems into the soil, and so they become available for other plants. But that process can be increased, if you like, by cutting and mulching with the comfrey 2 or 3 times a year. So I usually do that after it's finished flowering. I'll usually just cut it off and let it fall. That's where it is, especially if it's under a fruit tree, because that's what needs potassium. It's fruit trees that need potassium, because flowering and fruiting needs a lot of potassium to sustain it. And so, if you're going to have a lot of fruit trees, then certainly comfrey is one of the best things you can have to feed them with. Either, it can actually be growing beneath the tree, or you could have it growing somewhere else and cut and mulch and use it as a mulch, fresh mulch, underneath a fruit tree. Okay. So this forest garden started off in 1994 as a pasture field. So there was nothing growing here. It's bordered by the high conifers you can see to the west there, and ash trees. They're just outside the forest garden. And I chose this field. I had a choice of sites on the Darlington estate, and I chose this site for various reasons, but one reason was it had fantastic protection from the west. So due west is where the ash and conifer trees are over there, and shelter in a windy part of the country. Shelter is worth its weight in gold. It will improve the growth of trees, twofold probably, and anything fruiting will actually become productive much more quickly, and production will build up much more quickly in a sheltered site. So although there's some shading issues obviously near that big edge there, which is not a problem, because there are shade tolerance things you can put there. I'm quite prepared to put up with that in return for fantastic shelter. If I hadn't had shelter there, I'd have had to grow shelter, and probably I would have grown something fast growing like Italian alder, which is tall trees within the forest garden here. You can see are Italian alders. Those are 16 years old from seed, and they're a fantastic windbreak tree. Get very big very quickly, and they would have given me decent protection by now, but in the process, this wouldn't be so established if I'd had to grow shelter. So shelter is really important, and if people often ask me for advice, or sometimes consultancy about setting up their own forest gardens, and shelter is always the first thing to think about. It's very tempting not to. It's very tempting to think, I want fruit trees, get those fruit trees in straight away, but actually you should think shelter first, because the trees will do better if that's the way you do it, and very often people don't. They realise 2 or 3 years later actually they really should have put shelter in. They then put it in. Really it should be something you think about right at the beginning. Okay, so this forest garden then is about coming up to 17 years old, and I spent the first 2 or 3 years planting the main trees that are forming the highest layer, if you like, or canopy layer in the forest garden. It's not very high trees everywhere, because shade is an issue. So you can't have too many high trees because you start to get too much shading beneath. And then I underplanted most of the forest garden over about the next 10 years. It doesn't have to take you that long when you make a forest garden, but on this site various things led me to that kind of length. One is the size. It's just over 2 acres, which as forest gardens go is probably above average in this country. There's people making forest gardens from up to 5 acres or so, bigger than this, right down to small back garden sized forest gardens, where obviously you might have to make some compromises in terms of tree size and stuff. So 2 acres is a lot to plant out, to underplant especially. The trees aren't so bad on 2 acres. It's only about 200 trees or something you're going to plant, but the underplanting is much more of a task really, and that's something you need to plan in advance how long it's going to take you. So because I was the only one doing the work, I portioned that up into around 10 years of underplanting. So pretty much most of it is underplanted now. There are little patches that get replanted every now and then because I'm experimenting, and one of the experiments I'm doing is mixing different plants in the perennial layers and see what grows with what, because there's very little serious work been done on that or written about it. and sometimes those experiments work, and of course sometimes they don't. And if they don't, I'll often mulch them out with sometimes with areas of cardboard, like you can just see in amongst this area there are some areas of cardboard, and then replant with something else. So there are little bits of replanting on an ongoing basis, but most of it is fairly well underplanted. Okay, so from where you're standing now, this is quite an open and sunny entrance into the forest garden here. Just in this area up here, there's not going to be any higher trees really than this apricot, and the tree with all the tiny little pale green fruits on is Szechuan pepper. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And there's a mulberry to its left, and that's a type of dwarf chestnut there. It looks like a chestnut tree. So fairly low trees here with quite an open sunny area. So there's quite a lot of interesting perennial vegetables that need quite good light conditions right in front of us here. One which has just finished flowering, it's got these, well, a few flowers left, these little yellow flowers. Quite big plants, a lot of them have peeled over a bit. Is Turkish rocket. It's a very nice perennial brassica. And the young flower shoots, even now, are quite nice to nibble. So as you come past this, if you want to, it tastes a bit like a mustardy version of broccoli. If you want to nibble on one of those and go past, it's fine. The main crop on this is before these flowers open, and it's like broccoli, you know, and the unopened flower clump basically is the main thing you eat. You can also eat the leaves, but they're very, very hot at this time of year. They're better in spring. You know, they're fiery hot at this time of year, the leaves are. There's some other perennial vegetables. So, for instance, you can see a plant that looks like nasturtium climbing up some canes just there in front of the Szechuan pepper, and that is a type of nasturtium. It's a tuberous nasturtium called mashua, and that's a tuber crop from South America. It's one of the Andean tuber crops. It grows very well here. You can eat the leaves. They're peppery like ordinary nasturtium leaves. You don't get a lot of flowers on this one. But you get big tubers, you know, decent potato-sized tubers on that, and lots of them, and that grows very well. And as you can, it clambers. So you know, I've given it some canes, and it clambers into a bush, and that's how clambering things tend to grow in the wild. They're often on the southern edge, you know, of a shrub or a bush, and they can clamber up to get into the light. So, you know, in a forest garden, I'm trying to mimic what happens in nature as much as possible, and you know, that's one reason that a forest garden is very low input. It's because on the scale of, you know, agriculture, the further you are from a forest, which is what the land is trying to get to in our climate, the further you are from a forest, the more energy you have to put in to maintain it. So, you know, an arable crop or annual vegetables are the most energy intensive because in most areas anyway, the ground is cultivated every year. Soil cultivation is very, very energy intensive. You know, ploughing or digging, whatever way it's done, is very energy intensive. And actually, ultimately, I don't think agriculture is sustainable with almost total reliance on annual crops in the future. So that has to change. But as you get further and further towards a forest, the energy you have to put in to maintain your system gets less and less. Because, you know, if you left any bit of land in this country, apart from on a mountaintop perhaps, and did nothing, a forest would emerge. It might take several decades, depends how fast the succession happens, but that is what the land is trying to get to. And so because this system is distinctly forest-like, you know, it's not a natural forest, of course, it is a very low energy input system. So as we walk along here, you'll see a couple more tuber crops. One which is just climbing up the canes the other side of this apricot tree, and you can see it looks a bit like bindweed, the leaves on that. That's actually yam. That's Chinese yam, which is hardy. There's some hardy yams. Yams are not all tropical, so I grow two types of yam. Yeah, that's the ones you like, Tom. And they produce fantastic tubers, really lovely roasted. It's one of our favourite vegetables as a family.